So now we know everything that there is to know about Chochma and everything that there is to know about Binah. We are experts. We appreciate the whole intellectual process. We understand how it applies in the spiritual realms. We're ready to move further, right? So, yeah.
He's just got one thing to say. No, just one. In Keter, is it Yesh Ayin?
No. Keser is Ayin.
Keter is Ayin, and the next thing.
Chochma is Yesh Ayin. And then Binah is Yesh Me'ayin. Correct. Exactly. Now, in Sefer Yetzirah, which is one of the earliest books of Kabbalah, Sefer Yetzirah. Direct translation of that is the Book of Formation. Right? It's one of the oldest books of Kabbalah, and according to some opinions, it even dates back to Adam Arishon, at least to Avraham Avinu. It's definitely an old classic work of Jewish mysticism. So it says, Havein b'chochma v'chakeim b'bina. Okay, so let's understand what that is. Havein means understand, from the word bina. So it says, Havein b'chochma, that you should understand with chochma. And then it says, v'chakeim, which means to innovate, from the word chochma, v'chakeim b'bina, and that you should innovate with bina, which is a little bit unusual because you would have expected, the logical way to say things is chakeim b'chochma and havein b'bina, because they go together. They're effectively saying the same thing. So why is it that we have this crossover, that we have this unusual mixture of the word havein associated with chochma and the word chakeim associated with bina? The reason that this is so insightful for us is because one of the things that we have to understand is that whatever we're going to learn in our journey through the spheros, whatever we're going to learn, and we touched on this right at the beginning, is part of a network. And the nature of a network is that it moves in both directions. In other words, there is benefit to Bina that comes from Chochma, which is fairly obvious, because if you don't have the Chochma, if you don't have the original notion, there's really nothing to have Bina about. There's nothing to unpack, there's nothing to develop, there's nothing to understand. But what we're going to realize is, not only does the Bina satisfy the objective of the Chochma, but as we're going to learn, it actually generates new Chochma. Okay, so let's understand what that means. Before we do that, just by way of introduction, there are two systems that exist. Two systems, and we've touched on this before. There are two systems of spirituality that exist. The one system we described as Toihu, and the other system we described as Tikkun. And the distinction between Toihu and Tikkun is that in the reality of Toihu, everything that exists in a highly intense form, and as a result, is unable to really network. Whereas in the realm of Tikkun, which is what we're learning about, things exist in a somewhat reserved form, and that allows them to collaborate and allows them to network. So let's just focus on that for a moment so we appreciate what exactly it means, and then we can bring it back to this interplay that happens between Chochma and Binah. So the simplest way to understand this is, if you have somebody who is an absolute scientist, their life revolves around science, they've dedicated years to the research of science, they make all their decisions based on science, and let's just say that this person, not only are they in the world of science, but specifically, they happen to be a specialist doctor in a particular field. So everything that they will say about the medical process is going to be based very much on science. Now, you may have somebody who lives very much in the world of alternate medicine, right? And this is somebody who has invested all of their life into understanding herbs and homeopathy and various elements of the human body, the mindset, exercise, and so on and so forth. And they believe that all of the medication that the scientific world teaches about is actually unhealthy. It's actually not good for the body. Now, you put these two people in a room. So you have the diehard scientist and you have the naturalist in the same room, and likely they're not going to have a very happy conversation. The likelihood is that there'll be sparks flying between them, because this person is going to be quoting the absolute scientific proof of their method, and the other person is going to be quoting their lived experience of their method. And the scientist will say that's impossible, and the other person will say, well, science is very locked into a particular format of how you see the world, and sparks will fly. Whereas if these two individuals, let's say that you had somebody who was maybe not a specialist in a particular area, maybe they were a GP, and in their practice, they incorporate various elements of the natural world. Maybe they practice some acupuncture, maybe they refer people for reflexology, maybe they administer homeopathic medicine. So that kind of a person is not so die-hard in their particular area of expertise. Therefore, they're able to collaborate with various forms how you treat the human being. So in the same way, in a healthy system, the Chochma cannot be completely misaligned with Binah. That's not going to be a healthy system. Now, that doesn't only mean that Chochma is the producer of Binah. That's not good enough. It's not good enough to have a one-way valve, which effectively says, I give, you receive, and that's it. I have nothing to benefit from you. You know, for example, in the context of tzedakah, we see this principle, because in the context of tzedakah, the Gemara tells us that the wealthy man and the poor man, the wealthy man believes that they are doing more for the poor man, but in turn, the poor man is doing more for them. Meaning sometimes to be the giver is in fact to be the recipient. And that is the system, that is the network, that is a healthy engagement between different dynamics and different energies. So, on the face of it, Chochma gives to Binah, Binah takes from Chochma, and then develops and matures what Chochma has given. That's how it is on the face, and that's pretty much what we've learned up until this point. So we've seen Chochma very much as the seed, and we've seen Binah as the growth of that seed into something which is a fully developed organism. Or we've seen Chochma as the spark of an idea, and then Binah as the in-depth research and the mature understanding of the idea. That's how we've seen it, which is accurate. It's absolutely accurate, because that implies that Chochma gives to, produces Binah, and Binah benefits from that and then is able to develop something out of it. But now you've got the statement from the Sefer Yetzirah, which turns that a little bit on its head, because it says that you need to chakeim bebina, havein bechochma, and chakeim bebina. You need to understand bechochma, and you need to innovate with Binah. Now, what does that really mean? Let's think about it this way. What we learned last week, one of the things that we learned last week, is that the big distinction between Chochma and Binah, in fact, not just last week, over a number of weeks we've learned this, the distinction between Chochma and Binah is that Chochma is this flash, this absolute momentary clarity. So it's very much about light, and it's very much about energy, koyach, and at the same time it's koyach ma, so it's energy that is kind of undefined, even though it's got this incredible clarity. And on the other hand, we've said that Binah is breaking things down into smaller, more finite components, because that's how we understand things. So as you break something down, you lose the excitement of it. You lose the brilliance of it, because now you're getting into the brass tacks. You've actually got to go through process, and that's a little bit tedious at times, and it's a little repetitive at times, and it doesn't feel as flashy and as brilliant as Chochma is. So one of the ways to distinguish between Chochma and Binah is to say that Chochma is visual and Binah is auditory. Now that doesn't mean that's how they work, but the experience of Chochma is much closer to a visual experience, and the experience of Binah is much closer to an auditory experience. And one of the biggest differences, which we spoke about, is that when you have a Chochma experience, when you have a visual experience, it's everything at once. It's an instantaneous experience. That doesn't mean that you've really appreciated what you've seen, but the fact is, you've seen it all. Whereas Binah is like an auditory experience. You hear one bit of information at a time, and then you've got to string it all together and make some sense out of it. It's a longer process, a more tedious process, and a more removed process. So when you see something, it's very personal. If you've seen something, as they say, you can't unsee it. If you've seen something, nobody could dispute it because you saw it with your own eyes. So it doesn't matter if it sounds unbelievable to everybody else. The fact is you've seen it. Whereas when you've heard something, well, it's hearsay, and as the classical expression goes, don't believe everything you hear. And unfortunately, in today's world of AI, don't believe everything you see either. But that's another conversation, right? So don't believe everything that you hear, because at the end of the day, if you're hearing it, it's not your personal experience. It's not an up-close experience. Whereas seeing is an up-close experience. At the same time, it is possible for a person to see something and have absolutely no appreciation of what they've just seen. Whereas when a person invests the time and goes through the process, even if it is a complex process and a long process, at the other end, you feel solid. Now I actually know what I'm talking about. Now I actually understand the concept. So what happens so let's just test this for a second. When you experience Chochmah, what's the emotion that you associate with that moment of the Chochmah? Whether it's your own new idea, whether it's reading something for the first time that just is really brilliant, whether it's hearing something for the first, whatever the context is, what's the emotion that you associate with the moment of Chochmah? Excitement, right? Excitement, or possibly you could even use the word exhilaration, because that's what it is. It's a very dynamic experience. What is the emotion that you associate with having fully understood? In other words, you've gone through the Binah process, and now you've fully understood the concept. What's the emotion you associate with it? Satisfaction, right? Okay, so Chochmah is very much an exciting experience, and Binah is very much a satisfying experience. Now, here's where things get a little bit tricky. See, we, in the 21st century, and I think this may have started already in the 20th century, we live in a generation that is addicted to seeking happiness and pleasure. Right? That's really everybody. If you could tell people how to be happy, they'll be flocking through the doors to hear what you have to say. Right? And if you can sell people something that will give them pleasure, they'll buy it, and it will just literally empty off the shelves in no time. But if you tell people that they have to experience satisfaction, that's a little bit more, a little bit more remote, a little bit more distant, a little more abstract for them. And if you tell people that the goal is not happiness but joy, they look at you like, I don't know what you're talking about. Surely they're the same thing. But they're not. I don't even know if we really have a word in Torah for happiness. We have a word for joy. Very different, right? So, for example, everybody will tell you that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, who is rich? He who is? Everybody says satisfied, right? But the actual Hebrew is sameach, a person who is joyous, not happy, joyous in their portion. So easy just to mistranslate, and people often do that. We use generic terminology. We're forgetting that the Torah uses specific terminology. So the word that is associated with simcha is joy. That's something much more profound than happiness. Now, there's a certain part of the davening that we dedicate to joy, and particularly joy over things that have gone well for us, miracles that have happened to us. Which part of the davening do we associate with the joy of miracles, or the joy of liberation, etc.? Which part of the davening would you say that is? What do you say? Hallel. Hallel. That's what Hallel is for. Hallel is to give gratitude to Hashem for great miracles. In other words, Hallel is reserved for days of Simcha. That's why we do not say Hallel on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, even though they are Yom Tov, because they are not days allocated for Simcha. They are days that are Gilu Bira'ada. These are days of trepidation. But days of Simcha, we have Hallel. Great. Okay, so in Hallel, we have an expression that we use in Hallel that goes as follows. Aim habonim semecha. Familiar with this expression, right? Aim habonim semecha. Let's translate it. What does it mean? Aim habonim semecha. The mother of sons. The mother of sons is joyous. Okay, who is this mother that we're speaking about, and why is she not at shul? No, I'm just kidding. So who is it? Because she's got children, right? That's right. So who's the Eima Bonim Semecha that we're talking about? This mother that is the joyous mother of children. Who is this mother? Right? This mother is Binah. Because we're told in the writings of the Arizal, he develops a method where he identifies Chochmah as Abba, as the father, and Binah as Ima, the mother. Now it makes a lot of sense, because the relationship in the development of a child between the father and the mother is very much like the relationship between Chochma and Binah, where Chochma is the initial seed, and Binah is the development of that concept into something which is mature and developed and sustainable. In the same way as Chochma is the initial spark, and Binah is the development of that information into something which is robust and understandable. Which one is associated with Simcha? Aim habonim semecha. The mother of children, the mother is the place of Simcha. Now, why is it called the mother of children? And by the way, specifically in the plural. And yes, of course, we translate it as sons, but that's not the focal point over here. Because the reason that we call Chochma and Binah of Va'im or Abba and Ima, father and mother, is because when a person has a mature intellectual process, it will develop some kind of sensation, some sentiment, some kind of emotional attachment. If you don't understand something, you can't have any mature emotional relationship with it. So the children that we're going to be speaking about are the feelings and the subjective reactions that we have to things, which we're still going to get to. We're not there yet, obviously. And Binah is the incubator of midos, of meaningful, mature characteristics and emotional attributes. So therefore, Aim Habonim, we'll come back to it. We'll discuss why Binah is specifically associated with the development of emotional attributes. But for now, our focus is on Simcha. So the emotion that is associated with Chochma is the emotion of excitement, and the emotion that is associated with Binah is the emotion of Simcha. And in our world, people blur the two. People think that excitement and joy are the same, and they're not at all. Excitement, by definition, is short-lived. So any person who's looking for thrills in their life is always looking for new and bigger things to give them the thrill. So the most extreme example of that would be substance abuse. Because effectively what the drug does is it releases those chemicals that give us the thrill, and then the dose no longer does what it used to do. That's why the person needs to increase the dose, and that's what creates addiction. Now, it's all very well for us to sit here and be judgmental of people who have a problem with substance abuse, not realizing we all have addictions. Because we all go through the same process. There's the thrill-seeking brain that is the negative version of Chochma. What's the positive version of Chochma? Brilliance. What's the negative version of Chochma? Thrills. Short-term, easily dissolve and disappear, and therefore have to be replaced, and each time have to replace with something that is just a little bit more edgy. So if I live for thrills, then I'm essentially living with this very haphazard kind of life, this chaotic kind of life, where it's koyach, all of my energy comes from things that have no real lasting value. If I want simcha in my life, if I want joy in my life, then I need aim habonim semecha. Then I need to have something meaningful, grounded, developed, and mature. So where is simcha going to come from? Learning. And learning thoroughly. And understanding truly what it is that I've learned. Not, and by the way, I'm sorry to say this, I hope it doesn't offend anybody. In the frum world, we have thrill seekers as well. Got to hear the next big drosha and the next big podcast and who's the latest rabbi on the block and whatever the case is. Whereas simcha comes from me. I have to sit down and I actually have to apply myself and learn and review and make sure that there's depth to my experience and that I'm not just waiting for somebody else to hit me with their best shot. Okay, so that's aim habonim semecha. That's where real simcha comes from. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. When you experience simcha, what happens to you when you experience simcha? As I mentioned, we had this bar mitzvah at Shul on Shabbos. And to watch the simcha on these parents' faces for a variety of reasons, to get to this point of the bar mitzvah, took a number of miracles along the way. And so to watch the simcha on their faces, it was something really, really incredible. Now, what happens to a human being where you have real, powerful simcha? What happens? You forget yourself. What else happens? That's true. You forget yourself. You get caught up in the simcha and you let go. But it's not that you forget yourself so much. You forget your stuff. You forget your stuff. That's what happens when you have simcha. So you could have an individual whose life is really tough on a chronic basis. But in a simcha experience, when they have a true simcha in their life, the fact that life is tough is actually irrelevant right now. Not only is it irrelevant, as if to say, I'm not going to focus on that right now because I'm focusing on my simcha, it completely recedes into the background as if it doesn't exist. That is one of the things that happens when a person has a deep simcha. What else happens when a person has a deep simcha?
I think you connect with Hashem.
Good. So you connect with Hashem. Now let's unpack that and understand a little bit better what that means to connect with Hashem. Have you ever seen somebody who is experiencing true simcha moving slowly? No. Why? Why is that? Why does everything speed up? Okay, but that's a different story, right? So what happens with simcha? Simcha ramps everything up. That's what simcha does. The nature of simcha is it expands us. There's a famous story. What's the famous story with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Vespasian? Remember the story? Famous story. It's coming up Tisha B'Av time. We always learn the story. It's in the Gemara Gittin, which we learn on Tisha B'Av. So what's the story? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai smuggles himself out of the besieged city of Jerusalem, and he's speaking to Vespasian, trying to somehow mitigate the assault that's coming against the Jewish people. And he catches Vespasian at a very weird time where he's busy putting on his shoes. Now, the Roman sandal wasn't just a shoe, you used to strap all the way up the calf. So it was quite a big deal to put on your shoe. So he tells him, while he's talking to him, he tells him, they are going to make you the Caesar. They're going to make you the Caesar. They're going to appoint you the next Caesar of Rome. Anyhow, next thing what happens, a messenger comes from Rome to say, Hail Caesar, to Vespasian. Now Vespasian can't get his other shoe on. Right? Can't get his other shoe on. So he tries to take off the first shoe. There you go. He can't get the shoe off. So he says to Rabbi Yochanan, says, what on earth is going on over here? I can't get my shoe on, can't get my shoe off. A minute ago, everything was fine. So he quotes a pasuk in Tehillim that says, Ushmua toiva to dashen otzem. And when a person hears good news, it makes them swell. Physically, makes you swell. So he says, now what am I going to do? He says, bring somebody who you don't like, and that will make you cringe, and then you'll be able to get your shoes on. But the point is, Shmua Tova to Dashan Otzem doesn't just mean that when a person has good news, they swell. We even use the expression in English, right? You swell with pride. The word etzem, which could mean a bone, could also mean your essence. Your whole essence expands when you're in a state of simcha. That's why we know, for example, that a prophet was unable to experience prophecy unless they were in a state of simcha. Because if you're narrow, if you're, so to speak, cringed, if you're, like we have an expression here in this country, verkrampt, like if you're caught up in a very tight, overloaded, overbearing environment, you can't handle things that are coming from Hashem. So simcha expands a person completely. Now, what happens when a person expands their view? They have new chochma. So good, look at that. Havein bechochma, v'chakeim bebina. It's not only that chochma gives to bina. Bina, when it is done properly, when a person has a deep, meaningful, mature learning experience, and therefore they get more detail and more insight, which creates more joy because there is that simcha of understanding and appreciation of what you're learning, that opens the mind to be able to have a new chochma that you previously were unable to have. So it's not just that Bina consolidates chochma. It's that Bina stimulates chochma. And so the two create a cyclic interaction. Because of course now if you have more chochma, you have more to learn about and to contemplate on and to develop Bina over. So now you've spawned another whole cycle of the process. Let's take that from a different angle, right? We are in a phase in history where people have very limited attention span. Okay, really, it's a real thing. And there are a variety of reasons for this, which we're not going to get into now. The social scientists will give you one reason, and the Torah will give you a different reason. But the fact of the matter is, we live in a society that has short attention span. Therefore, one of the things that we deal with in today's world, especially in education, is that you've got to keep refreshing. Right? You've got to keep refreshing. So you can't, for example, go on and on and on and on about the same topic. You've got to do something that excites the students, that gets them re-engaged, Sometimes you've got to change between subjects. I mean, I don't know if you've ever watched how young people look at please God, they don't have them, but let's just say that they look at a screen on a phone. Have you ever watched it? The speed at which they move from one thing to the next is frightening. And I once heard an expression where they said, ever since the advent of Google, we have a generation that knows less and less about more and more. Which means we've created this very superficial experience of learning, which means people lack joy. Why are we such an anxious generation? Okay, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons we're such an anxious generation, and particularly the children in today's generation are so anxious, because think about it, try to live like that, where you constantly have to move from subject to subject, thing to thing. How can you possibly feel good? How can you possibly have joy? So in today's world, imagine if you had to tell somebody, sit a kid down and say, this is what I want you to do. You see this Gemara? I want you to learn this Gemara for the next 10 years. They would go into full panic mode. How can I possibly do that one thing for so long? I don't know if I could learn the same Gemara for 1 week, let alone 10 years. One day, exactly. And yet, therein lies the secret not only of simcha, but the secret of wisdom. Because unlike in any other academic process, where essentially what you do is you graduate. And once you've graduated, you don't have to revisit that information because you've graduated that information. In Torah, the second we finish a Gemara, the expression that we do is Hadron Aloch. My commitment is to return to you to relearn this Gemara again. Why? Not only because I intend to consolidate the information, although that's part of the value. Needless to say, if you don't review information, you can't consolidate the information, you can't guarantee that you keep the information. It's not just that. It's that I haven't begun to understand the information. The Chochma that I had the first time that I learned it felt so amazing, so inspiring, so intriguing. Now I've consolidated a lot of detail around it, and I feel that's it, I've done it, I've got the package. Move on. So therefore, what does it say? Havein bechochma, you've done that, right? You've understood the chochma that you've learned. That's appropriate. Now, chakeim bebina. You know that you've learned the material well enough when it sparks a whole new chokhmah that starts a whole new cycle that takes you through the process again from dot. And it might completely revolutionize everything that you thought you understood about that particular subject. That is true chokhmah, and that is true bina. Not only is the chokhmah the giver and bina the recipient, but chokhmah receives from bina the opportunity to stimulate a new chokhmah. So effectively, let's think about this for a second. Sometimes when we've, and by the way, you see this a little bit in the Gemara, I'll tell you in a second, but sometimes when we've learned something, what does a person say when they've finally got it? Like they've worked and tried to understand it and it wasn't so clear, and eventually they work it through. What do they say at the end? They say, I see. I see. Now I see. And what do we say? Chokhmah is a visual process, and Bina is an auditory process. That means that when I go through the Bina process properly, it now brings me to a Chokhmah experience around the information that I knew. So up until this point, it was information that I knew, and now it's information that I see. And once I see, then I have a whole new layer and level of experience. It's funnily enough on Shabbos, actually, there was a little debate running in the shul during the Kiddush, and then they came to me to adjudicate, which was quite fun. And the debate was, are you ever, as a Jewish person, allowed to feel satisfied in your growth, satisfied in your Jewish development? And right, can you imagine somebody even proposed that, right? Somebody even proposed that. And so it was like a funny thing to have to even address, but the point is, if you reach, that's why the word is joy, not satisfaction. If you reach a point of satisfaction and therefore feel, ad kan, this is the end of this journey, I have now reached the ceiling, I've now, so to speak, and people often use this expression, I've now finished this book, finished this Gemara, well then I've essentially curtailed the process. I've limited myself to what I believe I understand. Whereas if I go with an openness to say, that was just layer one, and who knows how many infinite layers there are of this experience, then I begin to sample some of the richness of what the Torah really has to offer. So therefore, Chochma-Binah, you need to have that cyclic experience where the knowledge that I have precipitates a whole new awareness for new knowledge. There are many examples. Many examples. We read the Torah every single year. We read the whole Torah every single year, right? What's the first thing that we do when we finish V'zois HaBracha? We open up the Torah and start Bereshis. Every single year we do this. And the truth of the matter is, we do it every single Pesach. We tell the same story that we told last Pesach. Except if I tell the story this year without any new vision, then I haven't left Mitzrayim for this year. Okay? And so forth. There are many examples of the same principle.
I'm sorry, I got a partial share every single of the life of years. And every time I get something else that I do not.
Exactly. But here's the point. It's not only that we get new information because we bring in new commentaries. It's even when you go back and review the same commentary, the same text that you learned the first time. If you understood it fully the last time you learned it, then you are guaranteed that this time you will get a whole new perspective. If a person didn't understand it fully the first time, then they're still working at that level. But if you fully understood that concept at that level last time, then what will happen this time when you revisit it is it will open a vista of a whole new perspective that you didn't even imagine possible. I'll give you an interesting example to illustrate this point. This is something that the Alter Rebbe of Chabad speaks about in extensive detail in chapter 15 of Tanya, but it's based on a Gemara. The Gemara is a very interesting Gemara. So the Gemara quotes a pasuk that says, "V'shaftem ureisem bein oived Elokim la'asher loy avodoi." That you should, it's hard to translate shaftem, to return, to settle, to review, to revisit. Okay? But the point is, pay attention. Basically, pay attention, or you'll see the difference between oived Elokim, between somebody who is in the present tense serving Hashem, la'asher lo avodoi, compared to the person who has not served Hashem. Okay, so what's the difference between the person who is serving Hashem and the person who has not served Hashem? So the Gemara says, I'll give you an example. The Gemara says, if somebody reviews their learning 100 times, that is called lo avodoi, you have not served Hashem. And somebody who has reviewed 101 times, that's called Oved Elokim. You are serving Hashem. So now the obvious question is, what's the difference between 100? I mean, for heaven's sake, can you imagine learning 100 times, right? Right, can you imagine? So what's the big differentiator between 100 and 101 times? And then the Gemara says, it will give a parable. The parable is that they used to rent out donkeys. So this is like Avis rent a donkey. So what happened was, if you rented a donkey to travel 10 parsas, which was like a decent distance, they would charge you 1 zuz for the rental of the donkey. But if you wanted the donkey to go 11 parsas, then the price doubled. So the question is, why did the price double? It's only 1 extra parsa. It's a 10% increase in distance, but 100% increase in price. And the answer is because it was normal for the donkeys to go a range of 10 parsas, and anything beyond that is, because it's unusual, it's worth a whole lot more. So the Gemara says it was normal in those days before the printing press to review your learning 100 times in order to consolidate the information. So growth happens at 101. And that's what we're saying over here. Chochma-Binah. Once you've reached the point of Binah and you truly understand exactly what it is, thoroughly, we're not just talking about some kind of superficial understanding. You truly understand what it is that you're talking about. Now, Chochma. Now you got to push the limit and cross the threshold and have a whole different experience by opening yourself to, there's a new way to learn this. Because again, what did we say? The key to Chochma is humility. So if I feel satisfaction, then I feel ego. I've done so well. I've understood. I've consolidated. At that point, that's exactly where we need Chochma. That's exactly where we need openness to imagine that there's something completely different in the story, and then we go to the next level.
Can I just somebody else? I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask, so is Binah infinite experience?
Oh, good question. Good Good question. So now we're going to be really careful when we use the words finite and infinite. This is a great question because Chochma is infinite expression that we experience for a finite time. Binah is finite information that opens a door for us to have an infinite experience. Okay, so again, that's it. That's like, it's an interesting concept, right? So Chochma is an infinite expression or an infinite revelation that we experience for a finite moment. Binah is finite information that we gather and collate that opens a door for us to have an infinite experience.
Can you say that again?
Okay, so Chochma is an infinite revelation that we experience for a finite moment, and Binah is a collection of finite details and information that we collate to open an opportunity for an infinite experience. Okay? And that's why the two have to work together. We can't believe at any point along the continuum that at this point I've either reached the end or at this point I've reached finite Torah. Torah will always be infinite at every point. Okay, we got to say something.
I was going to say that's why Hashem said we must learn we must serve Him with happiness, with joy.
With joy.
Because if you do, then you open up for more and more chokhmah.
Correct. And what we've learned over here is there is no true joy other than through Torah. So anybody who thinks that real simcha is just going to be on tap, doesn't work that way. Simcha is, as Dennis Prager says, he says happiness is a serious business. Simcha is a serious business. Okay, so I want to tell you a hypothetical story, okay? It's completely hypothetical because the facts of the story are deliberately inaccurate. But it doesn't matter. The story is to illustrate a point rather than to be accurate. So this hypothetical story starts in the 1960s with a GP living somewhere in North America. What should we call him? We'll call him Dr. Fine, we'll call him Doctor Who, but the Asian version of Who. Okay? So anyhow, so he's sitting over there one evening in late November. It's dark already because it gets dark very early. And it's freezing cold outside, and he's seeing his last patient of the day. And the last patient of the day has a terrible cough. And he checks him, and he prescribes whatever it is that he prescribes to treat the cough. And the patient goes home with his prescription. The doctor's about to close up shop, and suddenly he has a thought. The thought is, this patient who's just been in his office is actually a heavy smoker. Could there be a correlation between his smoking habit and the fact that he's got this really bad cough? And actually, now that I think about it, he actually has this bad cough every single year. So I wonder if there's a link between smoking and this cough. Now, this is the 1960s. Nobody's ever thought about this before. Smoking is very much socially acceptable. Okay. At this point, remember, some people here might remember they used to have these books called Choose Your Own Adventure. So at this point, he has two options. Option number one is to say, okay, that's interesting, and then go home and have dinner. And option number two is to give it some thought. So let's identify what has happened to the doctor at this point. He's had a chokhmah. He's been hit square in the eyes with a chokhmah that nobody's ever thought of before, that there may be a correlation between smoking and lung disease. So he has two choices. If he does not pay attention to the chokhmah, as we know, he's going to lose the chokhmah. And the next day, he might even remember that he had the thought, but it's not going to go anywhere. But instead, in our story, this doctor decides he's going to stay in the rooms just a few minutes longer and think through his patients. Who of his patients are the heaviest smokers? And then he pulls out their files and checks how frequently do they tend to have chest complaints. And he sees a pattern. He's now begun a process called Binah, right? Because that's what Binah is. It's analysis, it's research, it's cross-referencing, and he's doing those things. So he's going through his process, and he's collating the information, and he says, wow, this is really interesting. So he puts a little note on a piece of paper and leaves it on his desk to say, tomorrow morning, I'm going to call my colleague who's the GP, the next suburb over. I'm going to tell him what I found and ask him if he could look through his patient records and see if he sees anything similar to what I've seen, which he does. So the next day, he speaks to his colleague, and the colleague says, I'll get back to you later today. I'll have my receptionist look through it. And by the end of the day, he phones him back and he says, interesting that you should say so. There is this interesting correlation between patients that I have who are heavy smokers and recurring chest complaints. So the first doctor says, okay, that's really, really interesting. Thank you very much. And he decides over the weekend he's going to do some research. And of course, in those days, there isn't the internet and it's not easy to do research. But he decides he's going to do some research. He's going to phone a colleague who lives in the UK. Time difference, so he's got to work it out. Whatever he's going to ask him, see, maybe it's a localized thing in the northeastern United States. Does it have any kind of a global impact? And so by the end of the following week, he now has information that's come to him from the UK that guess what? Even in the UK, there's a correlation between people who smoke and people who have lung disease. So he thinks this is really, really interesting. I'd like to spend some more time doing some research about this. And he starts speaking to pathologists and finding out if he can get maybe lung samples from people who've passed away and seeing if they've been smokers or whatever the case is. And before he knows it, within a few months, this actually turns into a passion project that's taking up a lot more of his time than he expected. And so he chooses to take a sabbatical from his practice so he could throw himself into the research about what appears to be one of the biggest health crises in the world that really needs to be addressed. And so he spends the entire next year doing all kinds of research, both in hospitals and with postmortems, and analyzing people and getting some people to stop smoking for a period of time to see. He does a whole lot of research for the year. And at the end of the year, he is now ready to present a paper about his findings that illustrate that there is an undeniable link between smoking and lung disease. So he publishes his paper, sends it out to the American Medical Association, and it gets grabbed by everybody. It's published in all the journals, and it becomes a big deal. And now he is a sought-after speaker in all the medical circles because people want to hear about his findings, about his research, and to see if it's something that they should be addressing and how could they address, and what has he discovered, what is it in this, is in the nicotine or whatever that's causing, like what has he discovered. And so he has to take off another year from his practice because now he's literally traveling the world and meeting with all these big professors and heads of medical associations, and it's a really, really big deal until eventually he is recognized for a Nobel Prize for his work in medicine. This is now a few years down the line, and this is the pinnacle of his career. Here's a person that was just your local GP, and now he's this world expert, and he has this whole team of researchers and professors, and he's got grants from the American government, and it's a major thing. And they're presenting him with the Nobel Prize. So this is the pinnacle of any person's career. And it comes the big event, and he's got to go, and he's got to obviously receive the Nobel Prize and give an acceptance speech. And then there's this fancy cocktail dinner afterwards with all these dignitaries. It's a very big deal, and he spends 6 weeks before preparing his speech because this is now the highest level of experience he could ever have. And he goes there and he presents and he gets a standing ovation, and they give him the Nobel Prize, and he's got all the TV channels want to interview him, and all the dignitaries want to see him. And it's just a little bit overwhelming for a guy who's come from this little suburb in northeastern United States, to have all this fanfare and all this attention. So between the end of the whole formality and the beginning of the cocktails, he just needs to breathe for a few minutes because it's all a little bit overwhelming. And so he steps outside and has a smoke. So now the question is, what happened to all the Binah? Because here is somebody who has more Binah on the subject than anybody else. What happened to all the Binah? And that is our introduction into the next phase of intellectual development, which is Binah, as powerful, as joyous, as meaningful, as stimulating as it is, could remain absolutely theoretical. And it's not good enough to have the biggest ideas if they only remain theory. And therefore, we need to understand the next step, which is called da'as.
But dieting, you should